In April 2015, Leicester City sat bottom of the Premier League as they were almost guaranteed to get relegated, but somehow they survived, and in that same summer, their best player left on a free, they were forced to sack their manager, and all they signed was a bunch of nobodies as they were yet again favorites to get relegated from the Premier League. But that's not quite what happened, because somehow, with a new manager everyone laughed at, players nobody gave a chance to, and with almost no transfer budget, Leicester City were crowned champions of the Premier League in the most impossible season football has ever witnessed. But how on earth did they do it? How did the worst team in the entire league become the champions of England? This is not just another story. This is the full story of the greatest underdog team in the history of football. This story begins in March 2015 with Leicester City rock bottom of the Premier League, having not won a football match since January, as they looked destined to get relegated back to the Championship where they had spent most of the last decade and, at this point, was where they belong. You see, Leicester weren't a big club by any stretch of the imagination. They had a few big moments in their history, like the League Cup win in the 1990s, but come 2008, they fell as far as the 3rd division of English football, so their 20th place in the Premier League was pretty much expected. Their manager at the time was East Midlands local Nigel Pearson, who had been Leicester's head coach since 2008 and was a tough guy who would regularly swear at journalists and even once strangled an opponent during one of Leicester's matches. But despite his temper, he was a good manager who knew the Championship well, and that's how he managed to get Leicester promoted with an incredible 102 points. But the step up to the Premier League seemed too much. And it's not surprising Leicester sat rock bottom of the league because their squad simply wasn't very good, or at least that's what we thought at the time. In goal was Kasper Schmeichel, who was forever in the shadow of his father, Peter Schmeichel. In defense, there's captain Wes Morgan, the definition of brick shithouse, who at the start of his career was told he was too fat to be a footballer and had played more than 400 games in the Championship or below. In midfield, there was Danny Drinkwater, who had joined Leicester in 2012 after being released from Manchester United without ever playing a game. The wings saw Mark Albrighton, who had been deemed not good enough for a poor Aston Villa side, and Riyad Mahrez, a skinny winger who hated the cold weather and had been plucked from the French 2nd Division. Up front, there was a striker who Leicester had found in non-league obscurity, who was only a few years earlier playing to crowds of a few hundred supporters, who would spend more time boozing with his mates than doing fitness training, Jamie Vardy. And really, as much as some of these players are greats of the game today, nobody, and I mean nobody, thought they could ever become something back in 2015. But then in April, it's like a switch flicked and something changed. Leicester started winning. It began against West Ham, where Leicester's star player, summer signing Esteban Cambiaso, scored early on, and local lad Andy King got a late goal to give Leicester a 2-1 win. Then, the next week, Jamie Vardy scored a dramatic last-minute winner to complete a 3-2 comeback against West Brom. A 2-0 win over Swansea took Leicester off the bottom of the Premier League before Jamie Vardy scored the only goal of the game against Burnley to complete a 4-match winning streak and take Leicester out of the relegation zone for the first time since November. But the Foxes would come crashing back down to earth with a 2-1 loss against Chelsea, and the pressure finally made head coach Nigel Pearson snap when in a press conference he would call a journalist a stupid ostrich, saying, "If you don't know the answer to that question, then I think you're an ostrich. Your head must be in the sand. Are you flexible enough to get your head in the sand?" My suspicion would be no. But this ostrich rant seemingly reinvigorated Leicester, who then smashed Newcastle 3-0 and beat Southampton 2-0, drew against Sunderland, and hammered QPR 5-1 to finish the season in an incredible 14th, completing the greatest escape in Premier League history. And it was such an achievement that striker Jamie Vardy, who a few years before had been playing non-league football, got an unlikeliest of call-ups to the England national team, and somehow, within just 2 months, it looked like fortune had turned for Leicester City. But over the summer, the club were going to enter a state of crisis as seemingly poor signings and bad management was set to put the entire club in jeopardy. But now, before we get into the disaster of a summer and then the greatest season in the history of the Premier League, I just want to ask you to subscribe. It's free, and you can always unsubscribe later. Okay, now into the summer of disaster and then, finally, the year of glory. As Leicester City entered the summer of 2015, their star midfielder and player of the season Esteban Cambiaso turned down a new contract and decided to go to Olympiacos in Greece instead. And that wasn't even the worst news of the summer, as Leicester were about to become the joke of the footballing world as their Thai owners decided to treat the team with a trip to Thailand. But some of the reserve players reportedly made a racist sex tape while in Thailand, and to make things worse, one of those players was James Pearson, the head coach's own son. So the club's owners were understanding understandably furious, and Nigel Pearson was sacked as head coach of Leicester City, leaving the club needing a new head coach. So, within just 1 month, Leicester City went from the greatest survival story in the Premier League to losing their star man and their manager, and this is when they made the greatest decision in their club's history. Except, at the time, nobody would think that that would be the case. They decided to go for a head coach whose win percentage in his previous job was the lowest of any head coach ever, 0%. They chose a head coach who had been sacked by the Greece national team after losing every single one of his 4 games in charge, including a 1-0 loss to the Faroe Islands, which The Guardian called the biggest upset ever, as the Faroe Islands, whose entire population could almost fit inside Leicester City's stadium, were ranked 169 places below Greece in the FIFA rankings. That head coach was Claudio Ranieri, who had never won the league despite coaching some huge teams before, such as Juventus, Inter Milan, and Atletico Madrid. But in England, he was known for his spell at Chelsea, where he was nicknamed the Tinkerman for constantly changing his tactics and starting lineups. And despite being hired by some of football's biggest names in his almost 30-year career, the Tinkerman had only won 2 major trophies, the Coppa Italia with Fiorentina and the Coppa del Rey with Valencia, both in the 1990s. His personality and humor was the opposite of the brash and combative Pearson, but would that be the right personality for what many assumed would be a relegation battle? Pundits lined up to slag off Ranieri, with The Guardian saying it was baffling to appoint him and that if they wanted someone to keep them in the Premier League, then they may have gone for the wrong guy. That summer signings didn't really look like they would strengthen Leicester either, as the club signed Christian Fuchs, a player recovering from a long-term knee injury, and they made permanent the signing of Robert Huth in defense, as Huth had formed a solid partnership with Morgan while on loan at Leicester the previous season. And to replace Cambiasso in midfield, Leicester brought in the unknown N'Golo Kante from French side Cannes, where he had impressed in the previous season for his ball recovery skills. Up front, Leicester signed Japanese forward Shinji Okazaki from Mainz for £7 million, giving them a net spend of £20 million, basically peanuts in the Premier League these days. And with none of these signings wowing the pundits, Leicester were once again favourites for relegation and given odds of 5,000 to 1 to win the league, which is the same odds that you would get for a bet on finding Elvis Presley still alive or proving that the Loch Ness Monster is real. But it's these impossible odds and this impossible circumstance that made this next season so extremely magical. Leicester's first game of the 15-16 season was against Sunderland, a team also tipped to go down, so when Leicester won 4-2 with Vardy scoring early,
does deliver, helped on by who? It's found the way in!
and Mahrez getting 2 goals,
It is Mahrez.
nobody really paid much attention, but there suddenly was a lot of attention on Jamie Vardy later that week after a video of Vardy emerged that almost ended his Premier League career, as he was filmed in a casino using a racial slur toward another customer. But after Vardy apologized, Leicester decided not to sack him for what he called a regrettable error in judgment. And after that, Vardy would blank against West Ham, with Okazaki grabbing his first Premier League goals and Mahrez scoring again, giving the Foxes 2 wins from 2. 2 draws against Spurs and Bournemouth were followed by a 3-2 win over Aston Villa, and a 2-2 draw against Stoke meant Leicester had gone unbeaten for 6 games. But this great start was put to rest with a 5-2 battering by Arsenal, shattered with the BBC saying that Leicester's defense was so leaky that the club would soon find itself sliding down the table, as the team was yet to keep a clean sheet and conceded an average of 2 goals a game. So to try to encourage his defenders, Claudio Ranieri told his team that if they keep a clean sheet, he would buy pizzas for the whole team. Talk about man management. Now, let's have a quick look at Leicester's tactics heading into the season, as they took a different approach to the top teams in England, opting for a classic 4-4-2 formation, with one striker dropping deep to help the midfield and the other playing on the last man to try to beat the offside trap. And unsurprisingly, Leicester didn't pass the ball around as much as the likes of Arsenal or Manchester City, and only averaged 43% possession, but they were the best in the league for interceptions and ball recoveries, and they were second best for tackles. And their tactics were pretty basic: have a deep back line to get the best out of the immobile but strong in the air centre-backs Wes Morgan and Robert Huth, and also to create space for Leicester's other players to run into, as Jamie Vardy, Jeff Schlupp, and Mark Albrighton were among the fastest players in the league, with Ranieri saying, "My team is like the RAF. It's fantastic. Whoosh whoosh," as he compared the players to fighter jets. But the whole plan was tied together by the incredible passing skills of Riyad Mahrez, who would constantly find Jamie Vardy with his long-range passes, and if Leicester got an early goal, then they would just sit back and let the other team make stupid mistakes while chasing the game. While these tactics were simple, they were effective. But that loss to Arsenal meant Leicester had dropped back down to 6th in the league, and nobody expected them to finish any higher than mid-table, and what is definitely for sure, absolutely nobody expected what was about to happen next. You see, in that Arsenal loss, Jamie Vardy scored both of Leicester's goals, meaning he had now scored for 4 games in a row, and despite breaking his wrist, Vardy scored a penalty in Leicester's next match against Norwich to get them back to winning ways. 2 more goals in a draw against Southampton put him on 9 goals in 9 games, and he then scored his 7th game in a row to give Leicester a 1-0 win against Crystal Palace. But rather than celebrating Vardy's impressive achievement, Ranieri was off to the pizza shop as Leicester had finally kept a clean sheet. And with goals in 7 consecutive games, everyone was starting to take notice of Vardy. But in Vardy's next game against West Brom, he went down injured and it looked like the incredible goal-scoring run was over. But after lengthy treatment, Vardy returned to the game and scored moments later to keep his incredible run going. Vardy scored again from the penalty spot against Watford and got the opener in a 3-0 win against Newcastle that took Leicester back to the top of the Premier League. And that goal meant Vardy had scored in 10 straight games, equaling the record set by Manchester United's Ruud van Nistelrooy. And of course, Leicester's next game was against Manchester United, so Vardy decided to wear golden boots for the game, and when he scored with a low finish past David De Gea in the 24th minute to break Van Nistelrooy's record, he of course celebrated by telling United fans he had the record now. But while Leicester were second with 29 points, Ranieri wasn't getting carried away, saying, "Our first priority is to get to 40 points. That is our goal to keep us in the Premier League." And while Vardy was making the headlines, Riyad Mahrez also had 7 goals and 5 assists at this point, and the two of them were quickly being recognized as the deadliest duo in the Premier League. But as Vardy would fail to score in the next game against Swansea, it meant his legendary goal-scoring run would come to an end. But the Foxes wouldn't have to worry, as Mahrez would take over goal-scoring duties, scoring a hat-trick against the Swans to bring his total to 10 goals in 14 games. And now, people were really starting to take notice of Leicester City, but surely this good run of form was going to come to an end, right? Leicester won their next 2 games against Chelsea and Everton before losing 1-0 to Liverpool on Boxing Day, which dropped the Foxes back down to second in the league once again, and the period just after Christmas is seen as a make-or-break period in English football as the games come thick and fast. But Leicester seemed to forget how to score, drawing their next 2 games 0-0 before a 1-0 win over Spurs, and a 1-1 draw over Villa meant they had just 1 win in 5, and now people were really expecting Leicester to drop away, with even die-hard Leicester City fan Gary Lineker believing they would fall down the table. So Lineker made the promise to present match of the day in his underwear if Leicester did win the league, saying there was 0 chance that they could do it. But Leicester got back to winning ways with a 3-0 win against Stoke, and then in their next game against Liverpool, Vardy would score twice, including this wonder goal.
He is chasing it, thinks about the shot first time. Oh, what a goal!
By this point, Leicester's title-winning odds were no longer 5,000 to 1, but still they were only placed at 5%, as very few believed the fairy tale could genuinely come true. But then, in the next game, Leicester took on their main title rivals, Manchester City, and defender Robert Hoot scored right at the start before Mahrez doubled the lead, and Hoot would score again as Leicester won 3-1 to now give them a 5-point lead at the top of the table. Leicester's next opponents were Arsenal, and while Vardy bagged yet another penalty to give the Foxes the lead, Theo Walcott equalized for the Gunners, and then disaster struck as Danny Welbeck scored a winner for Arsenal in the 95th minute. Suddenly, pressure was starting to build in the next game against Norwich, where Leicester struggled for long periods, but finally they scored a last-minute winner in the game, and after drawing against West Brom in their next game, the Foxes would win 5 games in a row and keep 5 clean sheets in the process, which must have cost Ranieri a fortune in pizza deliveries, as Leicester went from having a terrible defense at the start of the season to having the second-best defense in the league. But Leicester's winning run would end in a 2-2 draw with West Ham, where Jamie Vardy would get sent off for diving.
Lovely touch to get himself going, and then he just brings his leg across his opponent, trying to initiate the contact,
causing captain Wes Morgan to say that the referee was clueless. But no Vardy doesn't mean no party for Leicester, as in their next game they battered Swansea 4-0 and then drew 1-1 with Manchester United, with Morgan getting the goal for Leicester. And now the stage was set. Leicester were on the brink of the most unlikely of seasons. They were so close to the Premier League title, and all they needed was one more win or a second-place Tottenham to drop points, and the title was theirs. Jamie Vardy decided to invite all the Leicester players to his house for a watch party as Spurs faced up against Chelsea, and Eden Hazard put on a masterclass to hand Leicester City the Premier League title. Yes, you heard me, Leicester City just won the Premier League title. They had the 4th lowest wage bill in the league, spent pennies in the summer, and were favorites to finish 20th, but somehow, against literally all the odds, Leicester City were the champions of England. They went on to draw 1 and win 1 of their final 2 games, closing the season off with just 3 losses as Jamie Vardy bagged 24 goals, announcing himself as arguably the deadliest striker in England. Riyad Mahrez scored 17 as he was named the Premier League Player of the Season, and the unlikeliest of heroes, N'Golo Kante, was now being considered as one of the greatest defensive midfielders in the world of football, as these 3 were the stars of this title-winning team. But Kante's importance was also spotted by Chelsea, who signed him that summer for £32 million, which is more than Leicester's total spend the season before. Arsenal also tried to sign Vardy, who stayed loyal to Leicester despite huge bids for him. And the next season, Gary Lineker kept his promise and presented Match of the Day in his underwear. But unfortunately for Leicester, their smaller budget started to show, as at one point they dropped as low as 17th in the league and actually ended up sacking Claudio Ranieri. The Foxes would recover to finish 12th, but the highlight of the next season would be their run in the Champions League, where they would finish top of a group featuring Porto, Copenhagen, and Club Brugge before beating Sevilla in the round of 16 to become the only English side that year to reach the quarterfinals. But a 1-0 loss away at Atletico Madrid and a 1-1 draw at home with Vardy scoring for Leicester meant that is as far as their fairy tale would go. Over the next few seasons, Danny Drinkwater would join Kante at Chelsea, where he would spend most of his time on the bench. Riyad Mahrez would make a £60 million move to Manchester City. Wes Morgan would retire in 2021, and Jamie Vardy would stay at Leicester all the way until 2025, where he won another major trophy in the FA Cup before Leicester began bouncing between relegation and promotion yet again, as it looked like the fairy tale story could not be repeated. But what a story it was. This isn't the only great story on this channel, because the one I have for you on screen is amazing too, so really, you should check it out and subscribe.